Hello, my friends. Welcome to the A show. That is an E with an acute accent mark. Coming to you today, actually my final day in Berlin, Germany. Had quite a lovely time. Hoping to record this and enjoy the rest of it. See a couple last restaurants and sites, etc. But in the most important city of the 20th century, I would argue. Not that this is a history-focused podcast necessarily, but a city that I've always wanted to come and see, and very glad I did. Exceptionally interesting, historically deep, and culturally rich, in addition to the kind of modernism and exceptional amount of youth currently occupying the city and controlling its kind of direction, I guess, but also the diversity in terms of age group and occupation is also exceptional. Affordability. It's a very model city in a lot of ways with very interesting historic background. But day after, I believe it's the German Day of Unity. That was quite interesting. And attended a FC Union Berlin game, which was nothing like anything I have ever been to before. It was an exceptional experience, a 2-3 loss against FC Raga. But exceptional game, exceptional crowd, exceptional atmosphere, and a great way to kind of wrap up my time in Europe. But getting on to that, we have what I believe is now going to be the 4th episode of the day, and today will include some visual components, actually. That I'll do my best to get on the YouTube version of this. So just a kind of a forewarning there that I don't believe we'll be able to access this on Spotify. I'll do some research into getting visual elements there, but have not been able to do so as of yet. And the topic today is one that's, I would say, not necessarily of as critical importance as maybe topics focusing on, well, they're all very important, but there's within, let's say, the area of transportation, there's certainly topics that are a bit more pressing. However, I would say there's not a ton of topics that have the potential promise of this. And within this topic, this is probably going to be the longest episode I've recorded to this point, but within this topic, there's a subtopic that I'll be exploring in greater depth later on. And kind of want to make the preamble now to really emphasize that this is an area of science and business that really needs time to kind of fully mature and develop and kind of bank today on the upward promise of tomorrow, because it is a very interesting industry, and the solutions that we have today in it are not necessarily the solutions that we should be settling on and taking with us for the rest of time. There's this will make more sense as I continue to go through it, but there's kind of a 4 or 5 different pathways to really focus on within this industry, and we really need to be making progress in all 4 or 5 of them because they don't all have the same potential in terms of their environmental benefit. But to end the preamble on Berlin and to get onto the actual substance of the A show being entrepreneurship, environmental technology, and societal benefit, let's say. We are going to spend our time today answering the question of what is SAF, and that is the acronym standing for Sustainable Aviation Fuel. I'm going to structure this in kind of similar ways to previous episodes, that being kind of an initial positing of what is the actual problem we're trying to answer here. Or this technology is approaching. What is the definition of this technology and what does that look like? Breaking down the pathways within this technology. What are the viable solutions within this? So we're going to have 6 or 7 or 8 pathways, actually 11 technically, but 6 or 7 that we talk about. And within that, there's only going to be a couple that are really viable, let's say, long-term, short-term, and medium-term. And from there, we're going to kind of look at what the commercial outlook is. Here, we're going to be incorporating some visual elements that are kind of help, and I'll guide you through those if you don't have access to that visually, but it's going to be very helpful. And I'll kind of also reference where I'm pulling these from, so maybe you can even source them yourself. But so going to be exploring those. Actually trying to play with the size of one of them right now. There we go. Exploring some of those, and those are really going to focus on pricing and production capacity. And then we're going to move on to an area of within that, kind of looking at what is the governmental approach and the policy support that's coming in or not coming in, and kind of looking at it from a general perspective. And then for the kind of final piece of the commercial innovation, looking at where specifically this innovation is targeting, kind of what the key technologies are going to be, and also kind of what we're looking at in terms of, in this specific aspect, it's going to be kind of mixed in terms of a little bit technological, like hard technology, think electrolyzers, which are technologies used to create hydrogen from various elements, but usually air or some other type of carbon input, as well as looking at less technical components. So thinking about aspects of commercial development and channel partnerships and business planning and how you should really approach those, to kind of expedite your development time. So kind of moving on from there, and then finally having a final take-home conclusions with, I'd say, 3 or 4 main points, and really trying to get a gauge on what the future of this area is. So diving straight into it, SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, what is the problem it's trying to solve? So as usual, it's going to be partially American-centric, just based on my own research availability and residency, but going to be touching on a lot of global themes. So jet fuel is responsible for 9 to 12% of American transportation emissions. This is third most among all transportation emissions. And at a global kind of rate, this is 2.5 to 4% of global CO2 emissions are responsible for jet fuel in the aviation industry generally, but mostly attributed to jet fuel. And when you take those numbers, they're quite significant. But like I said, they're not obviously third in transportation, so there's other areas of improvement that are going to be more effective. That said, never a reason to ignore something just because the problem is smaller doesn't mean it's not a problem. You can take that one to the bank. It's useful in environmental technology and life. But kind of moving past that, the keys to understanding kind of the jet fuel conundrum is that it really all has to come down to fuel. It's not quite as easy as, say, in the EV space, that being electric vehicles, specifically automobiles, in which you can kind of potentially branch out completely from combustion engines. It's really just not possible at the moment in air travel, and we'll kind of touch on why now, but I think at a high level, that's the key thing to take away. The specifics that I'm going to mention right now are not as relevant in my opinion, and things could change, you never know, and there's applications here for both of them, but battery-powered flight is useful on a short distance, but it's not feasible long distance in the terms of cross-ocean, cross-continent type travel, because of the weight of the batteries, and there could be improvements there, but kind of where we stand today and what we expect in the future, it's just not viable, and it would also necessitate a total reinvention of the aviation industry in terms of discarding planes, and you could gradually input that, but given that I believe the average shelf life of a plane is about 50 years or something, it's multiple decades. The investment is difficult to rationalize. Similar issue with hydrogen-powered planes. There's weight issues in terms of the fuel. A lot of promise there, more promise in my opinion than the battery-powered, but the fuel cells are quite weighty in themselves, and again, it's kind of more of a relevant pathway for short distance travel than long distance, but that's kind of the same issue in terms of having to reinvent a lot of aircraft travel. So that's happening, but I would say the more likely and relevant solution here is to really focus in on the ways to improve jet fuel in terms of its carbon emissions content and life cycle. So that's the problem, primarily focusing on the idea of difficulties in decarbonizing the aviation industry, and how we can focus on that is really through the fuels, trying to account for a fairly large piece of our transportation emissions. 10% is not minuscule. But now getting into what is SAF and sustainable aviation fuel, again, that's the acronym we're going to be using, but and kind of why this is potentially such an interesting industry, is because you can, with some of these fuels, achieve actually carbon negative. So you actually take in more carbon than you're putting out in terms of the life cycle of the fuel. So it's an intriguing proposition just on that alone, let alone being able to create a fuel that's 90% carbon reduction, 100% carbon reduction, but potentially even crossing that threshold of taking carbon out of the atmosphere while still making jet fuel. It's a fascinating idea. So I'm going to lead off with that because it's going to pull in your interest. But now we're going to kind of go through what this means. So a SAF is a fuel used to power aircraft that has similar properties to conventional jet fuel, but a more limited carbon footprint. The inputs, and let's define the character of these SAFs. They're really defined by the inputs. We're going to call feedstocks. You can think of this as a feedstock. A good example is to create wood chips. You need scrap or 2x4. I don't know. I haven't actually made wood chips before, but you need inputs. You need things you can feed into a machine. Thinking back to plant-based proteins, you need ingredients to put into an extruder to create vegetable patties or mincemeat. You need physical inputs. So the actual carbon footprint for SAFs are going to depend on the input or the feedstocks. We're going to call them feedstocks from here on out. The process used, like I said, there's 11 or so. We're going to touch on a number of those. And then, again, touching on this, it's going to vary in terms of how carbon intensive based on those two, as well as technically the use of renewable energies. We'll touch on kind of the place of that in a little bit, but renewable energies in terms of the manufacturing process and refinement. But those are going to influence kind of how carbon neutral or how carbon negative or how carbon positive, that's not the great term, but how much carbon basically and life cycle greenhouse gas emissions the fuel has. So another thing to touch on in terms of what is a SAF. SAFs vary in terms of their usability. Right now, most SAFs are limited to 50% blending, so you can have 50% kerosene. Kerosene is the actual jet fuel. What we know today is jet fuel, and SAF is kind of the blending that you would bring into it. You're limited to 50%. This is due to a number of reasons, mainly that a lot of SAFs lack aromatics, which are particles that expand to fill cracks or seals in engines to prevent leakage of fuels and other issues. They're very essential, and kerosene naturally contains them, but a lot of SAFs don't. That said, some do, and that's actually a big point of innovation for a lot of producers, but so not all of them are usable, and newer engines actually are much more compatible with SAF. So there's been flights that have been fully run on SAF. That's not new. I believe the first one ever done was in 2018 or 19. I believe it was actually done by Zero Petroleum out of the UK. Not exceptionally positive on that one, but I believe it was. I think it was actually done for the Royal Air Force, United Kingdom Royal Air Force. So they kind of vary. Most are blended, but a lot today are offered as what are called drop-in fuels. What you can think of this as, think of if there was a new gasoline alternative called, e-gasoline. This is actually kind of exactly down the same line as sustainable aviation fuels, because you can create gasoline and shipping fuels with this exact methods. And some companies are actually doing that. They're making airline aviation fuel while making petrol or gasoline synthetic. But you can think of this as a drop-in fuel would be something you can put directly in your car, and it's component-wise and usability-wise the exact same as gasoline or petrol. So it varies. Some are only allowed to be blended. Most, actually, I believe all are only allowed to be 50% blended at the moment in terms of 50% kerosene, 50% SAF, but a lot are usable as full drop-in. And now kind of getting into what I mentioned earlier is feedstocks. So what are feedstocks and what are they made from? So the feedstock in this case is going to be your source of carbon, because you can't just, mine or drill in and extract kerosene from the ground and refine it, and have that as your carbon source, that, decaying organic matter. You need to source some other source of carbon. And we're going to separate these into two categories, that being biological and then non-biological. Biological feedstocks include corn and oil, mainly from seeds, that oil. Algae is the new one, kind of the new kid on the block. And it's making some really interesting strides in the alcohol to jet category that we'll touch on later. Other fats and oils and greases, a lot of times leftover cooking greases and fats. Agricultural residues, you can think of this as stalks from things like sugarcane or corn stalk or various other kind of, cellulose-rich materials, including also forest residues. So kind of an interesting point on California wildfires. Another topic I'm going to focus and laser in on later, but not in this episode, but in a later episode. Trying to utilize high cellulose dense materials, and a lot of the under canopy, the kind of shrubbery and the early growth are very high in that content, much more carbon rich than potentially their larger tree dwelling neighbors. Not tree dwelling, but arboreal neighbors maybe. So being able to harvest and extract potentially useless and actually dangerous materials gives you potentially a source of carbon and feedstock. Moving on, additionally, you have wood mill waste as another potential biological feedstock, in addition to dedicated energy crops. And corn kind of falls somewhere in between on here, but a dedicated energy crop is made explicitly for the production of these type of fuels, whether it be for automobile or jet. And this also kind of goes back to the genetic engineering feature in the plant-based episode, where we really focused on, there's a whole industry now dedicated to creating optimized crops, not for eating necessarily, but for manufacturing. And manufacturing could mean manufacturing of food, or it could mean manufacturing of fuel. So very interesting to think about. On the non-biological side, we're going to focus on non-biological carbon feedstocks. That's going to be municipal solid waste streams. And here you want to focus on the idea, basically just think whatever you throw in the trash, parts of it, there's varying uses for various parts of it. Glass, for example, can be used in certain ways and not others, but basically everything you throw in the trash, not the recycling, can oftentimes be used in these feedstock categories, let's say. And the issue there being is there's an incredible amount of sorting that has to go on, and sorting here refers to picking apart what is and what isn't usable. I'm not entirely sure on the exact specifics in terms of like what, plastics 1 through 9 or whatever the current categorization is, which ones are and which ones aren't usable. So, because not all of them are recyclable. My assumption is that the ones that aren't recyclable are usable, but that's one source. You can also technically use, I believe there's technically an application of human waste. I know there's an application of manures and animal waste. So I would imagine there's an application of human waste here too, but I guess that's technically biological. Going on. The second focus for non-biological carbon feedstocks are going to be captured carbon. And the focus here, and I'm going to try to do my best to use the word captured carbon because I think there's kind of an emphasis in the clean tech industry right now of focusing too much on the term direct air capture, or DAC. We'll get back to that, but it's not just DAC. So DAC is the process of you basically put what looks like a space heater kind of in the middle of, I don't know, Norway, for example. I know that there's somewhat of an industry there. You suction in an amount of air, you process it, you separate the gases currently in that sample, you extract carbon dioxide, and then you use that carbon dioxide in the production of SAF. Not always in the production of SAF. There's other applications for DAC, but in this case, you would be using that. The other focus here would be point source carbon. Point source carbon is you attach kind of a funnel or a tube, or you additional factory. The key kind of demonstration here is somebody like Infinium, who we'll touch on later, but you basically assemble your production and manufacturing next to a carbon emitting source. And oftentimes this is free. Whether this will continue to always be free is unclear, or most likely not, because it's obviously becoming a valuable resource. But point source capture is the key term there. So being able to capture the emissions from a specific source, funnel them into your production, and use them. Those are the feedstocks we're going to focus on. Each of them have their own interesting backstories, and not just the two categories, but each within those categories have their own interesting backstories and applications and uses and arguments for why they're great. But those are just kind of where we're at. So moving now from feedstocks into the actual production, I'm going to go ahead now and cover the focuses, I would say, of the production pathways. There's a group called ICAO, which I believe is International Civil Aviation Organization. The O might stand for something else, but basically it's a conglomerate of all the representations of national aviation who come together and they legislate in terms of what is and isn't usable for fuel or aircraft standards, yada, yada, yada. They have 11 approved processes for SAF production. There's 7 additional ones in review and several more in commercial or in initial testing. Power to liquids, which we'll touch on later, was one of those, kind of in the not review, but in the pre-commercial innovation. So these are kind of the feedstocks, or the not feedstocks, excuse me, the production pathways that are in debate. And like I said earlier, we're going to focus on a couple of them, but they focus on translating a wide range of inputs, being those feedstocks I mentioned earlier, biomass or waste, into jet fuel. So what we're going to focus first on is a technology called Fischer-Tropsch, which was actually invented, I believe, by a German scientist, coincidentally being in Germany. I don't remember exactly when, potentially in the 30s or 20s, hopefully in the 20s. And it's a focus of taking carbon-containing material, breaking it down into a gas form, which is called synthesis gas or syn gas. We're going to be referring to it. And then you then combine that synthesis gas and you kind of function it into or manufacture it into jet fuel from there. Through various procedures in terms of manufacturing and refinement, but you create that synthetic gas. And there's a couple different versions of Fischer-Tropsch, and within that, there's even more variation in terms of when you get into renewable feedstocks, that carbon captured materials. But Fischer-Tropsch can be applied to a wide variety of inputs, including the kind of cellulistic materials, those kind of like plant materials. Like I said earlier, can be applied to captured carbon. It varies. There's 2 different Fischer-Tropsch processes that have been approved so far. But the kind of difference between them is one produces the aromatic compounds that I mentioned earlier, one doesn't. But both have a variety of applications and feedstock inputs. So The maximum blend ratio for both is 50%. Some great examples here in terms of this innovation, and a couple of these include E-Jet, which is the categorization of fuels made from renewable energy and captured carbon that often achieve a negative carbon footprint or greenhouse gas footprint, or a neutral. Those include Anerotech and Infinium, both of who operate in E-Jet, and I believe both technically operate in non-E-Jet as well, but Anerotech and Infinium both are great companies, doing really excellent work in terms of scaling up production. Another couple are Fulcrum Bioenergy and DG Fuels, again, two very interesting companies to look at. Moving on from that, the next topic to focus on would be hydrotreated esters and fatty acids. We're going to come to call this HEFA or HEFA, depending on where in the world you are, but HEFA in my case, HEFA. The process here is refining vegetable oils, waste oils, fats into SAF, through a process using hydrogenation. You remove kind of the oxygen content in the oil product, and then you crack and refine and isolate various elements in there within the carbon to create a jet fuel chain. And it's kind of applicable in both jet fuel and manufacturing of diesel. It's kind of a manipulation of carbon molecules, basically a way to think about you're kind of stacking them in a way to create certain chains you want. Again, maximum blend ratio here similarly is 50%. Some companies working in this space are Neste and Altair. Moving on from that, next process is going to go by the acronym SIP, that is synthesized isoparaffin. So this is the sugar kind of focus. So you take C6 sugars and you expose them to microbes, and you convert those sugars into farnesene. You then treat it with hydrogen, and you can just basically from that make it into a SAF. Max blend ratio here is 10%. This itself is kind of a niche production process. It has, potential and manufacturing grade facilities already, but it's kind of niche. So there's a joint production facility by Total and Amyris, that is AMYRIS, going on, who is kind of the best example of this. Another really interesting pathway, and for full transparency, the kind of pathways that we're going to be focusing on, I should mention this now, are going to be focused on Fischer-Tropsch, HEFA, and alcohol to jet, including a couple other ones that we're going to cover now. Alcohol to jet is a process of converting alcohols into sustainable aviation fuel by removing oxygen. You then link the alcohol molecules together. You isolate and then create the carbon chain you want. There's a more technical name for this, oligomerization, I believe. Oligomerization. Issues when you struggle with chemistry on my end. But there's two current feedstock focuses here for alcohol to jet, or A to J as it's known. That's ethanol and isobutanol. Also a significant amount of exploration in the methanol to jet category. Maximum blending ratio for all three of these, regardless, is 50%. But there's very significant commercial testing and approval processes going on for that methanol to jet category, and isobutene actually as well. So alcohol to jet's a kind of a complicated one because it has a couple different types of production inputs within those already varied feedstocks. So something to consider. Some producers in this space are Swedish Biofuels, HIF, which stands for Highly Innovative Fuels, but they go by HIF, and GIVO, or GIVO again, depending on where you are in the world. But all of these three focus on alcohol to jet, and alcohol to jet, just as a precursor, is going to be one of the ones to watch because it is incredibly scalable. Eventually, it runs into feedstock issues, but in the medium term, incredibly scalable. Moving on, another one we're going to cover now is CHJ, or catalytic hydrothermolysis, thermolysis, I believe. Converts fatty acid esters and free acids, or free fatty acids rather, into SAF via catalytic reaction, followed by any combination of hydrotreatment or hydrocracking or other various refinement processes, including fractionation. Maximum blending ratio here is 50%. This is a very interesting one because it's mainly used for byproduct inputs, kind of residual oils from production of other things. And that's kind of why you're seeing somebody like Chevron, and technically the company Chevron Loomis Global. They have a joint research project with Applied Research Associates to create those, being able to utilize basically like unused byproducts, make it into jet fuel, which is an interesting but not necessarily a dominant or especially fast-growing part of SAF. The last process we're going to touch on here is a version of HEFA, which is HC-HEFA, which is hydroprocessed hydrocarbons, esters, and fatty acids. It's a bio-derived hydrocarbon or free fatty acid and fatty acid ester that are upgraded in the technically HC-HEFA process. They're similarly hydroprocessed and saturated, and then removed. The oxygen is removed from the hydrocarbon molecules, and you expose, usually in terms of feedstock, specific variations of algae or algae, again, depending on where you are in the world, but specific species usually, which are very carbon rich and fatty in a way. The max blending ratio here is 10%. I'd probably say that's going to bump up in the next years here, but great example of a company working here is Viridos, Viridos. They just received a $5 million investment from United, who is a very big player in the SAF industry, and I would say when they're making moves, you should probably look. They have their own venture fund specifically dedicated for this, but just kind of putting that one out there. Okay, so having covered now, this is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sections of SAF production pathways. I'm now going to kind of slide in a mention of what power to liquids are. So power to liquids are a production process utilizing renewable energies and captured carbon to create sustainable aviation fuel. Specifically, this is called e-jet or e-fuel. If it's not jet fuel specific, it could also be diesel or gasoline synthetics. It's made using Fischer-Tropsch and that captured carbon renewable energy. You then expose it to a reverse water gas shift reaction. This isn't especially important, but just to note it. And then electrolysis or co-electrolysis. This is the fuel where you're going to achieve those kind of projections of 100% or 100% plus greenhouse gas reductions. So when we're talking now and we're moving now into a new section, what are the viable solutions? I'm going to spend a whole separate episode focusing on power to liquids. So I'm going to keep that as kind of a common theme, but I'm not necessarily going to focus explicitly on it, even though it is by far the most potentially impactful solution. So other viable solutions within those I just mentioned: Fischer-Tropsch utilizing biomass and municipal solid waste. So think of this again as trash. And alcohol to jet utilizing power crops like corn, sugarcane, or biomass can achieve 85 to 94% greenhouse gas reductions. So really important to note that there's kind of a variation in terms of which feedstocks and which production processes are most usable and also can achieve really, favorable results. It's not, one or the other. There's kind of variety here. You have commercial pilots ongoing with companies like HIF and Infinium, taking very similar approaches, even though Infinium focuses on Fischer-Tropsch and HIF focuses on methanol to jet, I believe, is their focus. I don't believe it's ethanol. But taking very similar focuses and actually both using renewable fuels. So this is also kind of coming into a question of, is power to liquids just, Fischer Tropsch, or does it also include alcohol to jet? And the kind of definitions here are kind of blurry. I'm not going to be the one to define that, but something to think about. You can utilize renewable energy in a lot of different ways, and that's something when you look at where HIF and Infinium are locating their plants. It's important to note locating several in Latin America, in countries with very high renewable energy potential, both in terms of marine energy and wind and solar. Texas, another focus for both companies, same kind of thing, high potential for renewable energy. And then in France is one they're both also operating in. Not as high a potential for renewable energy, but pretty significant. I would say the key difference between these two is HIF is kind of operating in kind of a project management role. They're kind of licensing out technologies and building kind of very efficient chains of operation within their own facilities, but not technically creating much themselves. Infinium is, working with other people, but their main innovation is that they're partnering with, in terms of their carbon acquisition, they're partnering with manufacturing facilities and industrial plants who have excess carbon. So they're locating their plants in areas where they can have pretty easily accessible carbon inputs. Something to think about, and kind of an interesting business model. Moving on from that, both those technologies are very interesting. Both of them are scaling at a pretty quick rate, but they are not commercially competitive. And we'll touch on that right after this. But before I do that, I want to kind of give you an outlook on HEFA, which I believe will be the kind of the bridge for these fuels from full kerosene reliance now to kind of a transitional period for SAF. So HEFA is already really commercially mature. It's been something that's, I remember it was in like 2007. I remember somebody talked about it in a presidential debate in terms of using corn as fuel. I remember that very clearly. But it's very commercially mature. It's been worked on for decades now. UC Berkeley, my alma mater, actually has a facility focused on renewable energy and materials that was completely funded by, I believe, ethanol fuel. I don't know how you would say money or research contracts, but it's a very ugly building on the very northwest tip of campus. Very ugly building. Tangent, but I don't know. That I always think of that when I think of these fuels. Similarly, the highest end of HEFA can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80%, but this is usually not the case. It's usually more often around 50%, in my opinion, which again is 50% less carbon emissions. Not something to scoff at, but it's not quite at the same efficiency in terms of environmental benefit as the others. So this is where we're now going to start playing with some images here. The first one is really going to be a commercial outlook, and this is really going to be the core of these images in terms of like trying to get an understanding of where the economic status of everything stands today. So when we look at issues, I think scale and price are the two that are kind of the burden here. And now I'm going to be pulling up this first image. It's from a Rhodium Group analysis. And this is, in my opinion, slightly outdated, but it's a good reference point. So here we're going to be looking at unsubsidized levels of production costs across alternative SAF production pathways. And there's other factors that go into this. I don't believe they're including, in this case, transportation costs, obviously not including the subsidies that they receive. And that's especially important as we begin to talk about where things stand today. That is, I believe, October 4th, 2023. And we'll get into the policy support that's been going on. But here we're going to be looking at HEFA, gas, Fischer Tropsch, power to liquids, and alcohol to jet. So important to note, we also have an underlying kind of price floor, competitive price floor, let's say, that is U.S. jet fuel price. So there's always going to be that to compete with. And when we look at these four fuels, we have a high end and a low end. And I think it's very important to focus on a couple things here. one that I'll immediately point out are that certain fuels have very high ranges. So when you look at power to liquids, the floor is $6.13, most optimal production, best efficiency, I'm assuming. The ceiling is $11. That is almost double. So there are certain elements of price unpredictability, and I think when you start looking at power to liquids and alcohol to jet, also gas Fischer-Tropsch, but power to liquids mainly, alcohol to jet to some extent, but alcohol to jet has made some really impressive strides since this image has come out, but it's important to think about the commercial maturity in terms of looking at these ranges. These aren't going to exist forever. Power to liquids is kind of an interesting case, especially with the scaling of renewables in that case, but not going to exist forever. The technology is pretty immature, so that probably attributes to a lot of it, but kind of going off here. So the price generality for U.S. jet fuel is going to be $1.90, I believe, per gallon of jet fuel. HEFA is going to run you $3.40 to $4.90. Gas Fischer-Tropsch is going to run you $6.07 to $8.30. Power to liquids is going to run you $6.13 to $11. And alcohol to jet is going to run you $7.41 to $11. So kind of gives you an idea of the price points, what we're dealing with in terms of comparisons, especially to baseline jet fuel. Also kind of ranging here in terms of maturity again. Scale is directly related to price. They're not completely, but when you think about who has fully commercial scale facilities, HEFA does, power to liquids does not. Alcohol to jet is just now getting there. So when you start thinking about this, the creation of full-scale facilities will inherently lower price, but E-jet is going to remain pretty exceptionally expensive just because it's banking on technologies to create usable jet fuel from literally air, and you're not accessing. I had a colleague say free stores of carbon. The freest store of carbon is drilling it from the ground and extracting it. The next best alternative is getting it from cellulistic biomass, crops, etc. Things that are growing have carbon in them, and you can extract them. The air is, sure, it's tons of carbon, but it's in terms of what's the word? Availability maybe, or concentration. There you go. A lot more carbon found in better sources, more concentrated sources. So that's very important to note. And again, HEFA is most price competitive just due to the natural age of its technology. Continuing on that, scaling, going to now transition to another figure. This is going to be coming from McKinsey & Company in 2020. And this is going to touch on the global operational capacity that was announced in 2020 and the models that were built in terms of that scaling for SAF production capacity. So starting in 2022, there's an annual SAF production capacity of 0.9 billion gallons per year. Moving up, that graduates to 1.5 billion gallons, 3 billion gallons, 2.92, 4.26 billion gallons in 2025, and 4.34 billion gallons in 2026. And the projections from McKinsey & Company here are very reflective of my own opinions as well. It's a focus on HEFA and not necessarily Fischer-Tropsch, alcohol to gas or alcohol to jet. So let me zoom out for a second. The category is broken down into it's a bar chart, and then there's 4, if you can't see this and listening on Spotify, 4 or 5 bar charts ranging from 2022 to 2026. And then within that, it's a split bar chart. So you have 4 different categories. You have blue, which represents HEFA, orange, which represents alcohol to jet, yellow, which represents gas Fischer-Tropsch, and then a gray, which is other. And this is most likely that kind of the sugary, I'm trying to remember the name. I believe it was SIP, synthesized isoparaffins, being able to convert sugar to jet fuel, basically. And that's going to scale very quickly because you have massive sugar plantations in certain parts of the world that are very cheap to access and very easy to transport, and also very rich in terms of their fuel density. But important to note here is that HEFA expands massively throughout this, but it does kind of start flatlining already by 2026. And I think at the very end, I'm really going to start talking about projections in terms of what fuel is going to dominate by what decade. But something to note is that HEFA is going to grow really, really quickly here in the coming years, but probably taper off just because of its natural feedstock and flexibility. When I say feedstock and flexibility, I just mean ease of which it can start kind of accessing and then acquiring the feedstocks it needs to continue producing. So at a high level, I'm going to kind of move away from that, but I think it's important to look at that graph and really understand that HEFA has a very kind of not exponential, but very quick growth ahead of it, as does kind of those other categories. But when you look at alcohol-to-jet and gas-Fischer-Tropsch, both of them are around 0.1 billion gallons a year, and within from 2022 to 2026, the projection only has it growing to 0.2 and 0.3 respectively. So what I want to make clear now is that the scale of SAF production is nowhere near the demands in terms of fuel content. So in the US, current production levels of SAF are around 4.5 million gallons a year. The chart I just referenced was global. So we can currently produce 4.5 million gallons of SAF a year. The hope is that scaling HEFA at a really substantive rate can kind of get it to achieve that 2/3 rate of SAF by 2026. So if you can scale at that rate and get to that $4.3 billion or 4.3 billion gallon mark by 2026 at a global level, again, I wanted to share the US one because people think the US is kind of leading in technology. We can only produce 4.5 million. That's insignificant in the grander scheme of things. But 4.3 billion gallons of SAF by 2026. This is 8% of global demand of jet fuel. So, like I said, HEFA is going to experience a really dramatic and unprecedented in a lot of ways rise in terms of alternative fuel demand and production capacity. It will still only be 8% of global demand. So this is a huge problem, not in terms of its environmental impact is significant, but not in terms of that. It's a huge problem in terms of scaling up production. That's what we're going to keep coming back to, is a need to scale production. So global consumption of jet fuel, for reference on all those statistics I just mentioned, was 60 billion gallons last year. Again, 4.3 billion is not much. It's 8%, a little more than a drop in a bucket. Let's say it's a glass in a bucket, nice healthy glass of water. So now kind of coming back to the bigger questions on commercial outlook. What do we need to kind of continue scaling, and what are the things to look out for? So there's more investment that's needed. Any industry could say this, any startup could say this, we need more investment, we need more investment to scale, we need more investment to scale. Poor investment levels, though, are really driven by the high production costs associated with this, especially in terms of power to liquids. That's a real sticking point for a lot of investors because it has a lot of technical components that a lot of other SAFs don't have. But this creates a negative feedback loop, which was a term that Rhodium Group, I believe it is, kind of coined in terms of this kind of cyclical nature that people claim there's not enough investment in SAF. Investors come in and are interested and, intrigued by the potential carbon reductions, and they're not impressed by the value or the costs associated with production. And so they kind of say, no, we're not going to invest in this. It's not profitable. So it creates a really negative feedback loop. There needs to be a lot of government intervention, and there has been, and we're going to talk about that, but to really start and kick off this industry and really get it going. Kind of touching on now the issues in terms of feedstocks. I think that there's really a focus again, on separating it out by biological and non-biological. So biological carbon feedstocks run into an issue of availability due to high competition. A lot of industries, especially in the fuel and transportation space, but in other spaces as well, looking for carbon dense materials or other components, run into each other basically in competition and also a geographical distribution. Not all of these are available everywhere in the world. A lot of them sometimes, especially when you look at something like algae, are actually have to be manufactured in lab settings. So there's a high degree of competition and a low degree of geographic availability. So either you have to locate your manufacturing facility near these type of feedstock areas, or you have to import them and face really high competition and cost. Again, here we're talking about corn, oil seeds, algae, fats, oils, greases, agricultural residues, forestry residues, wood mill waste, energy crops. The non-biological carbon feedstocks like municipal waste have that sorting issue that I mentioned earlier. Not all of it is usable, so you have to be very diligent in terms of sorting what is and what isn't usable. And here you again run into production issues and scaling issues. How effective can you be here? There's certain promises and developments in terms of technological abilities that kind of make a more intriguing argument for these, but again, it's not necessarily the optimal technology. Moving on from that, you also have just general issues in terms of pricing for carbon from non-biological sources from direct air capture. I mentioned that earlier, but right now it's nowhere near price effective enough to warrant a full direct air capture to E-Jet or direct air capture to SAF generally facility. It's just nowhere near affordable. So again, going to need to have some real innovation there. And I think kind of a technical innovation on the sorting side that I forgot to mention. There's been some innovations in terms of pressure plate weighting. So being able to tell kind of the weight and texture of something from some type of plate below the sorting mechanism, or computer vision. Being able to feed an algorithm images of exactly what type of product you're looking for, and then creating a sorting mechanism that can differentiate between those two. But again, that has its own issues and development needs. So getting back onto the focus, again, last touching point for direct air capture, it's just too price intensive, especially when you consider the need for electrolysis and reverse water gas shift on top of that to make it usable. Over the coming decades, going to continue becoming more and more prevalent, but again, right now, the outlook's not great, and it needs a lot of innovation to get to that point in terms of where it's usable, and it's going to probably have to come over a decade or so until it's really taken seriously in a commercial setting. So now getting on to the public leadership element of this, the policy side, there's a couple breakdowns here, and I think the three main categories of support are going to come in blending quotas, mandates, tax credits, and a final one in investments. Going to try to put this image, although it's going to be maybe a tough squeeze, so I might have to just describe it. The number of policies, it's charted on a bar by 2013 to 2023. In 2013, 14, 15, 16, and 17, there was a total of 1 per year global policies enacted in the SAF space. In 2023, we now sit at 33 policies enacted to support SAF. So really emphatic global movement towards the creation of more sustainable jet fuels. Great to see. There's also a split, very interesting split in terms of currently being discussed and adopted policies. So of all the policies charted by, this was ICAO, the organization mentioned earlier, International Civil Aviation Organization, 53% of all 53% of all SAF support policies are currently under development, so not passed yet, which is both tenuous and scary, but also potentially beneficial because it means more input could come in and more alterations could be made. And in my opinion, the longer this discussion continues, the more clear it's going to be that innovation and investment is needed, not necessarily that outright acceptance of status quo HEFA is the way to go. So one more breakdown in terms of policy type. It's been sorted in terms of the most prevalent types of policies enacted, and I think this is really interesting to note. And it also kind of speaks to a geographic breakdown of support on these policies. So the least prevalent policy, with what looks to be maybe one, is incentives and task force. The second being with 2 incentives, another 2 roadmap. Approaching 4 is target policies. So these are a little bit more malleable than mandates. Targeting policies are, we're going to try to get to, China is really big on these. We're going to try to get to 25% SAF by 2030 or whatever. That's unrealistic, but that type thing. Economic incentive. This is where the US is really the leader. This basically means for something, say like EJET. The Inflation Reduction Act has a policy in which the utilization of green hydrogen, so that's hydrogen made through renewable energy, is more beneficial in terms of tax credits than hydrogen made without renewable energy. So also another policy is a tax reduction for, jet fuel specifically. If it's less carbon intensive, it scales up as the carbon intensity decreases. So a carbon neutral fuel, I believe, gets like a 50% per gallon or $1 per gallon more than 25% reduction. So it's staggered and tiered, and that's a very American policy in terms of the SAF space, and then something that, in talking to European colleagues, both at the policy and private level, are kind of skeptical of, because the largest policy group approaching, let's say 16 enacted policies, is mandates, and Europe is huge on these. So the idea being that you have to achieve a certain amount of SAF at all airports by, say, 2030, 2035, 2040, 2050. And I think the best example of this is Refuel EU. So SAF mandates at all airports in the EU. That's kind of the crux of the policy. 2% of all airports' fuels must be SAF by 2025, and this rises kind of gradually every year to 70% in 2050. So pretty ambitious, pretty bold. And there's also an EJET subsection, which focuses on very similar policy. For reference, the 2030 mandate is 1.2% of all fuel must be EJET, and then 2050 is that 35% of all fuel must be EJET. So that's kind of the European approach. Looking kind of beyond that, you have countries like Brazil who are implementing blending quotas as well, and those mandates to achieve 10% CO2 reduction by 2037. Again, like I said earlier, the US has their kind of own unique system. They also have more commercial airlines are the ones more responsible for implementing the blending mandates. We're not, maybe because it's the issue of interstate travel and interstate regulation, which I don't believe is actually constitutional. God, I'm trying to remember the case. That was in like 1800 or something, or 1796. The case that prevents interstate regulation in certain aspects. God, I wish I could remember that case. EP Gov, Mr. Formaker, right there. Maybe that's U.S. history. Maybe it was Mr. Forbes. Maybe it was both. Porque no los dos. But again, the U.S. is much higher on the idea of economic incentives than it is on the idea of blending mandates. Blending mandates are coming much more so from the private sector and the airlines themselves. And kind of a final point here is on the EU is that they've been very proactive. That is the airports themselves and the countries legislating the airports. France is the best example of this. All the Parisian airports, so Orion, I believe, and Charles de Gaulle, and all kind of I believe the Marseille airport as well. There's kind of a ring of airports in France that all have signed blending demands and mandates and commercial partnerships with producers. So that's kind of an interesting variation here. You have the government kind of mandating, and then within that you have the airports themselves signing exclusive blending contracts, either prompted or unprompted. So something to really think about, especially when you compare the American to the EU strategies. moving kind of forward from that, you also have approaches that are maybe a little bit different in other parts of the world. I think the really interesting one to me personally is the UK Jet Zero strategy, which amongst other things, including mandates and blending quotas, includes a £165 million investment in domestic SAF production. So this is going to go to companies like, and here I actually want to stop before I mention these companies. The UK is actually a leader specifically in that E-Jet realm, the power to liquids realm. They're leading in terms of just innovation generally. There's other companies scattered across the US but and the world, but I think Britain per capita is really, fighting above its weight and doing a really great job in terms of innovating OxyCU and Zero Petroleum, who I believe have rebranded now to Zero. Both doing really excellent work in this space and being able to utilize really interesting commercial innovation strategies that are obviously coming from direct public investment in this industry. When I look at, let's break them down a little further. Zero is able to provide numerous types of fuel, and that's kind of how they're focusing on kind of creating industrial demand. And kind of invaluability. And then OxyCU has created all these different side streams and selling specific components that they're best in class in to other producers, while also producing their own fuel and selling products that are byproducts like plastics on that. It's a very unique issue to have and a very unique solution to propose. So really good work on the UK there. Additionally, you have in the US FAST, that is FAS-SAF, and FAST Tech grants that are both going, it's kind of a similar investment strategy to the UK, going to support innovators in this area. And then I think at a final kind of public sector analysis, you have Japan, India, China, Canada, the UK, Denmark, Brazil, Indonesia, most of the EU, all creating SAF obligations and blending requirements and production thresholds, usually up until 2050, oftentimes just to 2030, 2035, but oftentimes up to 2050 as well, especially in the EU. So yeah, I think you have kind of a mosaic of different approaches, a mosaic of different attitudes and ideas of what is and going to work, what is and isn't going to work, that is. And, time will tell. I think, interestingly, there's kind of a bitterness in the EU towards the Inflation Reduction Act and how it kind of really, what would be the way to describe this? Really energized and motivated the green infrastructure in the country and kind of the building towards more renewables and SAF and hydrogen expansion. And the EU thought it was kind of an issue in terms of competition, and they wouldn't be able to compete. But EU has proposed their own solutions, and here we are today with some really great strides being made, not only in SAF but in hydrogen production and renewable energy, really focused in the global northern hemisphere, and in North America and the EU. So yeah, very impressive. And also the UK, which is no longer a part of the EU, as I now realize. So kind of moving on, I kind of discussed earlier those interesting interactions between private and public forces, and I think I want to spend some time focusing on the clients now. So just going through the commitments in terms of buying SAF, here's kind of what we're dealing with. So United Airlines has 7 total commitments totaling over 14.3 billion liters. And sorry to go between liters and gallons. These are just the metrics I was given, or found rather. This is really important to note that United Airlines has 14.3 billion because the next closest is Delta Airlines at 3.9 billion liters, over 8 commitments. Other notable airlines in this area that range between 3.8 to 1 billion liters include Oneworld, Lufthansa, Air France KLM, Air BP, American Airlines, Japan Airlines, Cathay Pacific, and JetBlue. All making very great strides and really relevant contributions in terms of picking up SAF. But I think United still is probably the most relevant here. They have their own venture arm dedicated towards SAF and decarbonizing jet fuel, which is very cool. United Airlines Ventures, I believe it's called. And they're very well connected in the SAF space and innovating, but they're betting really heavily. So something to watch, something to think about. In terms of the production side, some numbers for you guys to work with. These again come from the ICAO. GEVO is at 3.5 billion liters in offtake agreements. Fulcrum, these are the highest to lowest, or highest when I stopped. Fulcrum Bioenergy is $6.7 billion, or 6.7 billion liters. Alder is 5.7 billion liters. Semvita, 3.8 billion liters. Shell, 2.8 billion liters. Neste, 2.5 billion liters. DG Fuels, 2.2 billion liters. And Dimensional Energy, 1.2 billion liters. So a couple really thriving producers as well. And I think the really important thing to take away in a conversation, again, I had with a colleague on this topic is that there will always be a market for SAF as long as these regulations stay in place. And interesting kind of to think about is that it incentivizes producers just to keep producing. It's a very interesting market dynamic and propped up, of course, by government support, but very fascinating when you think about it, that producers can just, start pumping this out and somebody will buy it more than likely. So now we're reaching kind of the home stretch of this exploration of SAF, which has been very interesting. So right now, I'm just going to focus on some of the key innovations from a technological and channel partnership standpoint. I've already touched on a lot of them, one of which being kind of like I mentioned earlier, that kind of unique dynamic in France where a lot of actually airports were ahead of the game and not allowing things to be dictated by multinational or international airlines or government organizations. They were very much ahead of the game in organizing offtake agreements and blending mandates and channel partnerships to really get exclusive or semi-exclusive access to SAF. So that's by itself, its own interesting kind of focus. But I think something you're going to see is an increase in public-private collaboration, especially in trying to produce alcohol to jet to rival HEFA in the medium to short term. Obviously, alcohol to jet is a very interesting category, and it eventually runs into some issues in terms of feedstocks, but I think that's kind of the transitional fuel from HEFA to powder liquids, in my opinion. So a great example of this is both the UK Jet Zero investment timeline, where they invested multi-100 billion pounds, or 125 billion pounds, I think it was, 165 billion pounds, UK Jet Zero strategy that was. But a great example is a program undertaken across Europe by Swedish Biofuels, Lufthansa, Sky Energy, that is NRG, Sky NRG, not energy, ENERGY, but NRG, E4 Tech, SCA, Remeski, Keskus, I believe, and then Vrije University in Brussels, all came together to create and start research on a new alcohol to jet pathway that is exclusive to them, that is very low carbon, but high intensity and high efficiency production. So you have a very interesting amalgamation of partnerships and techniques and technology providers that is really doing some great work in terms of facilitating partnerships. And I think HIF is another great example here, who have realized that maybe they have certain elements that are very beneficial, but they don't have every best-in-class element in terms of SAF production. So being willing to license out and kind of share in the profits is something that's very interesting as production scales. Something I touched on earlier is the role of aromatics in SAF generally, and you're going to continue seeing more and more fuels that can claim aromatics naturally occurring in their fuels, making them fully drop-in ready. I think kind of an interesting side note here to add would be that you're going to continue seeing maybe more delays in terms of regulatory testing, but an increased emphasis on regulatory testing earlier on in the process. Power Liquids is getting a great head start here and really trying to get their fuels tested as soon as possible and really try to get things moving commercially to scale. And now to focus on power to liquids. I think it's an interesting kind of situation they find themselves in, and where they're trying to kind of scale at a rate that's alongside both renewable energy and access to carbon sources. It puts them in a very precarious situation in terms of attracting investment, while only being able to say, like, hey, we're going to have to wait on these number of inputs, and there's not really much we can do about it because that's our commitment in terms of our technologies. But they are offering exactly the technology that proposes carbon negative jet fuel, and that in and of itself is enough to kind of warrant a lot of interest. So there's a lot of high industry interest, but investment is another story, and there needs to be greater gains in terms of efficiency to really start attracting that. All that said, there is and I'll touch on this in a spotlight focus on E-Jet itself, but there's a increased emphasis on new production methods, especially one called one-step conversion. The idea here being you can amalgamate all the steps required in E-Jet, being reverse water gas shift and electrolysis, all in one process that has lower energy requirements and proposes really significant price reductions. So something to think about. A final point is, one more is that OxyCU is working in that space, and so is Air Company, another company based out of America. I think the final point on innovation I'd like to make is that you're seeing interesting elements. I think OxyCU is a good example of this in terms of their utilization of side streams, but you're seeing increased interest, not necessarily from Shell or Chevron, in investing in or replicating Fischer-Tropsch or other technologies, but in utilizing their own side streams to create jet fuel. And I think a big one here is those sugar elements, or being able to use byproducts generally. And Chevron's a great example here, as I mentioned earlier on in the podcast. But yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, and I think it's a very interesting market generally. It has a lot of different moving parts all at the same time. But this one is very interesting too, because they're really not engaging at all with any innovation. They're just taking their own route and saying, so be it. Shell is a little different. They're kind of starting to develop factories for this, but Chevron is making a very interesting play in which they're not really too interested in market dynamics that maybe don't suit them, or they would need to diverge and make massive investments. It's very interesting. Whether that will change remains to be seen. So, as we come to the end of this focus on sustainable aviation fuel, now officially the longest episode I have, there's a couple kind of final takeaways I have to list. I think to preface them, I'd kind of like to say that all of this is somewhat speculative. There's a lot of hard science and research that's gone into these findings and companies, but you don't know for sure the future of an industry that is so reliant on government support ever. We're in a really good moment right now of belief in climate change and technology, and the idea that we can repair and prevent a lot of environmental issues, but there's no guarantee. I think you're seeing this kind of in the UK now, where there's kind of a certainly a negative element of feedback on the Prime Minister's recent kind of scaling back of environmental concerns and regulations. But I don't know, it's a natural swing of things between conservative and more, or let's say not conservative, but reactionary and radical policies. Oftentimes kind of a pendulum, and you have kind of, pushes for environmental progress, and then you kind of have more limitations, restrictions being lifted, opening up of regulation. So, it's natural, but I think it's imperative to note that projections made here are very much impacted by those, especially in this industry where so much is directed by government incentives and investments and mandates, and those could all be stripped away next year. Who knows? But kind of moving on from this, first kind of take-home conclusion, the overall number of agreements and total liters agreed to be purchased per year has declined from 2022 to 2023. And, we're not at the end of 2023 yet, but anticipated decline of about 50%. If things change really radically, maybe about 25%. This doesn't necessarily trigger any alarm in terms of the industry sinking overnight, but and obviously we've had some issues in terms of access to credit, and then what's come to be known as the era of free credit, which is an awesome term now coming to an end, especially in America, and that we may have potentially wasted a great opportunity for renewable energy scaling and SAF scaling, whatever. But a little bit of a slowing down in terms of expansion and number of offtake agreements reached, amount of fuel purchased. But I would raise that this trend represents something more significant, and I would say it represents airlines and airports waiting for potential price decreases with new subsidies from IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act coming into effect, fast SAF coming into effect, investments in domestic production in France and England, the UK, I guess more generally, coming into effect and trickling down, and then efficiency improving. I would say it's more so that. Definitely part of it is due to kind of global economic conditions that kind of are, since COVID, varying very wildly year on year. But I would say a lot of it is due to that. Kind of the wait and see model here, and kind of waiting to see where producers are going next and what that means for pricing. Just kind of emphasizing this one more time, SAF, and especially E-Jet, which I'll kind of focus on later, but will always require government support through subsidies. But there's a hopeful model here, and it comes from HEFA. As innovation improves in production and efficiency in transportation, price declines. Things scale, price comes down. It's the natural order of things, which is, great to see. But you have to give it time, and it's going to need a couple, cycles here, perhaps decades. In the case of power to liquids, to really get to a point where HEFA is now, I'd say. For power to liquids to get to where HEFA is now, you probably need 10 to 15 years, maybe 20, but 10 to 15 probably. But the model is there. HEFA no longer needs that dramatic financial support the way alcohol-to-jet and E-Jet do. So potential is there, and the case study is there very clearly. Final couple points here. The progression of pathways utilized are going to focus mainly on HEFA. Again, kind of going back to that, it's more economically affordable, even though it's not as environmentally beneficial. These are going to come before, or the scaling and focus on HEFA is going to come before alcohol-to-jet, Fischer-Tropsch, power to liquids. But as I promised, I'm going to give you kind of a decade-on-decade breakdown here. So the way I see it, HEFA is really going to continue scaling throughout up until 2030s, and kind of somewhere between that 2031 to 2035 mark, you're really going to get, that is crazy to think about, 2030s. You're really going to get a pretty radical expansion of alcohol-to-jet, and Fischer-Tropsch somewhere a couple years after that, or maybe a year or two after that. And by 2040, you're really going to see a kind of a transition as Fischer-Tropsch kind of competes with alcohol-to-jet. The elements needed for Fischer-Tropsch in the power-to-liquid sense are really going to improve so dramatically, hopefully, with the renewable energy scaling and access to electrolyzers specifically, and proliferation of green hydrogen, as well as carbon acquisition agreements, whether that's point source or direct air capture. Hopefully direct air capture. If it's direct air capture, you can have a proliferation of SAF production globally, which would be very, very cool. But as those things kind of come into being in probably the early 2040s, you're going to kind of see alcohol-to-jet, as HEFA kind of will likely fall into the wayside somewhat. You're going to see alcohol-to-jet start declining, Fischer-Tropsch start increasing, and then within kind of that Fischer-Tropsch increase, power-to-liquids is going to really expand, and it has potential for an exponential increase. None of these other production pathways do, because they're limited by feedstocks and issues in terms of geographic availability or industry competition for feedstocks. direct air capture has no limitation in terms of its production capacity. It's just getting it to a point where it can achieve that in terms of price readiness. So it all comes down to feedstocks at the end of the day. That's really what it is. I started this with kind of a focus on the idea of, as Andrew Huberman says, no input, no output. If your inputs are very limited, your output is going to be very limited as well. The thing that Power to Liquids has over all of these other HEFA, SIP, I believe it was, the sugar one, Fischer-Tropsch using, cellulosic biomass and alcohol to jet, is that you have a real availability and a massive scaling potential of direct air capture. Whether that will actually translate into a commercial realization, hopefully. It remains to be seen. Hopefully so. I think point source capture offers a great alternative, but it's not necessarily scalable in the way direct air capture is. It's nowhere near scalable the way direct air capture is, but something to think about and chew on, and hopefully by 2040, 2041, 2045, you really start getting that innovation in direct air capture that has scaled to a point where now power to liquids are inevitable. So, that's kind of what it all comes down to. I think that sets up actually the power to liquids segment of all this very well. But yeah, in what was just over 80 minutes, now closing the images and notes I had in front of me, in just over 80 minutes covered the gambit of what sustainable aviation fuel is, how to produce it, what the processes and feedstocks are, who's supporting it, how are they supporting it, and what it looks like in terms of the future. It was actually more challenging delivering it than it was producing that information. So I hope you all took something away from that. I hope it sheds, glimmer of positivity in the future of decarbonizing a lot of our transportation. But it's a pretty good encapsulation of, I believe, where the sustainable aviation fuel market falls today. But that has been the A Show's representation of SAF. Welcome any questions or conversations to be had. You can reach out to me through parkerbovee.com. Find my LinkedIn there and shoot me off a message. That's the topic we find ourselves in today, and hopefully moving on to EJet later on, and signing off from Berlin, Germany, back to the US tomorrow, where we should continue putting out these videos. And again, this should be the first one with visual content. I'm really excited for that. Hopefully continue making a difference in terms of spreading this information globally. But that's going to be all from me, Parker J. Bovée at the A Show. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Hope you guys learned something new today. And that's all from me. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.